Is our chat here? Oh, there it is. Hi. I am Chris from Airwindows, and we're doing our live stream. And here, let me put it to live chat. And this is one thing that I can end up talking about a little bit. I'm only doing that so that I can pause the window while it is showing it. And that's so I'm not distracted by pictures of things too easily. Hey, I'm back. So, here we are again in our interesting times, and I have just posted another maintenance release. I posted, assume everybody can hear me. The meters certainly show that stuff is happening. I posted the standalone version of Dithermy Timbers, and my hope is that that'll be handy, and also I'm about ready to move on to other things, probably, because there is still a couple of other experiments that I have in mind that I'm looking to try, and the image that I briefly showed you is not that. Hey, Bo. Hey, David. You'll forgive me for being kind of gulpy and stuff, because I'm not feeling super well. I keep like coughing up little bits along and whatever. It's probably aftermath from me getting really sick in March, if that's what I think it might have been. And like many others, I think that all I can really do is kind of go forwards and see where it takes me. Hey, Preston. I'm trying to remember whether I needed to set anything else up in the live streaming. Probably not. Yeah. I am on low latency streaming, but it's not super low latency streaming, and that ought to be satisfactory. So, hey, I've actually worked through my plugin backlog at the moment. Right now I don't have a whole pile of stuff yet to do. So that leaves me able to go through my sheaf of possible things to do, and I think that's plausible. There are a number of things ready to happen, but the thing that I was showing you, which is this image here, is something I'm considering as far as I'm going to see whether I can do a kind of oversampling that's probably more effective at like 96K, but I'm thinking in terms of finding a way of being able to work with a kind of oversampling that will help work on guitar amp plugin type things. Because I do feel there's a number of reasons why I'm warming to that. And I still prefer using the amp myself. I still also feel like I'm not sure if I have what I would choose for a guitar DI setup right now. Although I could probably test that out even while I am on stream if I really wanted to. I wouldn't be able to hear it though. I'd just be pumping it through to the stream, and the stream would hear it and I would not. The thing that I'm showing is an idea based on trying to do. This is kind of inspired by somebody that I saw posting something on Gearslots. It is a resolution increaser plugin, and I pretty much know what the guy is up to, and I'm not quite sure how that functionally operates, but essentially it seems to me that the person talking about doing this on the Gerstlot's thread, he was getting a certain amount of blowback because what he was promising is not really practical, was something kind of like this, where if you have individual sample points and you're trying to imagine that you have additional stuff in between, you can just sort of interpolate and it'll act a little bit like you have extra data. And how accurately you do that depends upon what kind of sound you're going to get. Like, you can add sample points and carefully calculate them out so that they are exactly rolled off at the original sample rate and get a very good reconstruction of what the original sound was like. And normally if you upsample stuff, that's what you get. But there's always been digital processors from way back, from like back in the 90s and stuff, where they would internally oversample, but they'd reconstruct the sample rate differently to get a different sound. And if you do something like this, if you just linearly interpolate between the sample positions, what you get will not be accurate, but it will have those edges, those corners. And if you were to reconstruct it really finely, so that you were very carefully following the angles and corners, then smooth contours would basically act without a lot of highs being added, and then sharp corners would produce a unrealistic corner that was not part of the original recording, and it would sound like highs. So if you have a cymbal or something like that and you do this to it, it will make the cymbal sound like it has more highs than it does. Certain sounds will act like they were recorded with a far higher sample rate, and certain sounds will be screwed up and wrong and not be correct. So this is something that's always been done. Like, doing this, it's not dissimilar to not using a reconstruction filter, which is another thing that some DACs do. If you don't use a reconstruction filter, then it completely eliminates the problem of the reconstructed audio overshooting the... Here, this is a good thing that I have this camera set up. I wasn't sure I was going to do it, but now I'm going to need it. So suppose you have a series of samples that are like this, and you need to reconstruct it. What's going to happen when you reconstruct that? Let's assume that the edges are straight here. What's going to happen is that the output waveform is going to need to follow a path to produce what would have caused that position of the samples. I'm not sure a statistical probability thing would actually help there, Bo. Because what's happening here is, if you've got your set of samples like this, if you were recording it like that, there would have to be a sound producing that result once the calculations were done typically you're recording at a much higher sample rate and then decimating it down to what would make this happen. If you're generating stuff on just the DAW, like boosting things or whatever, and you produce a sound like this, then you're forcing the reconstruction to happen as if there had been an original sound causing that. Let's suppose that the sample values were maxed out. They were full crank. Oh, look, spotty ink, yay. What's then happening is that your position of your sample values are causing the output to clip, because these lines represent electrical clipping of the DAC. It's electrical clipping of the chips and things that make up the digital audio, the digital to analog converter. Like your op amp is going between positive 12 and minus 12 volt rails. And if the reconstruction goes beyond that, the best you're going to get is clipping. The worst you're going to get is this. There are op amps that are available where if you drive them beyond the power supply rails, they flip to the other side. So this is the worst case scenario, where if you clip the output with this digital related reconstruction filter overloading, it's also been called Gibb effect, you can really screw up the sound in a extremely spectacular way. That is about as much tweeter blowing high frequencies as you could possibly ask for. So there's the problem with some of that stuff. Now, what I was thinking of in context with this one, I'm assuming that the fellow who's doing the process this way in order to get more resolution, like take a 44 or 48K and his program or whatever it is that he's doing will spit out 192K, and it'll have information rather than just being a direct sample rate conversion that has no higher harmonics left, because you're not starting with higher harmonics. Doing something like that will generate higher harmonics, and it'll come across as information on the output. It's just not anything like accurate. And what I thought was, supposing you were going to calculate this out and do this thing, you could be doing a sort of 3 times oversampling. It is the TL07 whatever chips that I've heard that about, but I haven't experienced it happening. That said, there is a kind of chip that does it, and it could be the it could be particular brands of TL07, 72, and so forth. I think it's 70, 72, and 74, and the last digit is the number of op amps in the chip. So what I'm thinking is, what if I did a oversample that would try to produce the information in some reasonably legitimate way, then do distortion or whatever, and then downsample in some more primitive way. And specifically what I was wondering about was whether I can do it in such a way that I can make the oversample properly handle the output case of the downsample would be just getting an average, like an average of the output values in a very primitive way, ideally one that would operate only using divide by twos. In other words, the word length shift gain that I like to use, because I don't think anybody has tried to do sample rate conversion that is non-optimal but optimized to hang on to the clearest image of the mantissa of the output word. Essentially passing through the audio as untouched as possible, but still doing something that acts like oversampling. So this is experimentation I'm going to have to do. Yeah, and Zachary, you would indeed be running into that problem with bass preamps or boosts failing in a horrible way, because bass is really good at producing high voltage spikes of exactly the kind. It would basically blow your tweeters or just make a really horrible bright noise on some of your pops and clicks. So that's the worst scenario that you could want. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. It would be exactly like a supersonic snap. That's exactly what you're describing. I'm also looking at some other plans, like I'm warming to the fellow who wanted the gate out of C-strip. I don't remember exactly who that was, but it seems like the kind of thing that I would normally like to do. And I'm also looking to experiment with dark a little bit. I feel like I might be able to improve dark, or maybe not. Depends upon whether I did those experiments already. I also have a concept that's from somewhere else that I'm looking at now. Oh, when somebody wants me to do some more work on the firmware for the chord organs, I have just let that one drop for the time being. Ah, it was you. Cool. There is a way of generating, I'm not sure what you call it, integral noise. Like extremely dark noise, darker than pink noise. And I am looking to experiment on that, because there are ways of doing more researches. Some of this stuff gets really overwhelming at times. I gotta confess to you, I've got a lot here, and I will do what I can with it all. This is the point where I start choosing what's going to happen next week, so there is that. There's the one where I need to do a newer version of the Point plugin that's a little more approachable, and have to check that it works properly at 96K. Got a lot of things here. Let's not talk about that right now. I'm definitely a little flustered. Like I said in the plugin post, I live in America, so I think we're all a little bit unsettled right now. But I'm hardly alone in that. If people wanted me to expand outwards into that area, I'm sure I'd have much to say about it, but I'm not sure that that's the greatest idea. People who are, I don't know, more close to me personally tend to have a clearer idea of where I stand, and those who are not paying attention to the guts of how Airwindows works would, I guess, be terribly surprised or something. I don't know. So Ghost is asking, would you mix into Mojo? Very possibly, yeah. The thing is, I can tell you exactly what's going on with the distinction between Mojo and tape. That is that I'm reminded of, there were some webcomics that I followed around about 9/11, 2001, and a number of people were extremely grateful that there was somewhere that they could go where things were basically just operating normally, and they weren't being clobbered by all this current event stuff. And I respect that. That makes sense to me. So I am my little nerd out space, and I can maintain that to the best of my ability. We will see how that goes. So the thing about replacing Mojo with tape or vice versa, tape is a specific. I think tape runs off a spiral, honestly, and tape also has high frequency processing. It handles highs slightly differently than just straight up distortion. And tape also has the head bump in it. Mojo doesn't have any of those things. So if you were to go from tape to Mojo, what you'd be getting is a very different style of saturation. Depending upon what version of Mojo, it might be a saturation where it starts wrapping around again when you distort it even harder. Some of those algorithms, the standalone versions of them, don't always max out. At the highest peak, they will continue to wrap around and get quieter again when you push them even harder, and that's part of how they get their sound. But it's not a drop-in replacement. It's definitely not a drop-in replacement. So I'll also note another thing that I've seen recently, and this is of great interest to me, although I won't necessarily be able to do anything about it right away. But I've talked about how I'm gearing up to run in this hardware hacker dimension. It's one of the reasons I have, the camera, so that I can start soldering things and people can see what I'm doing. I also expect to start moving on that pretty much as soon as I cut some pieces of wood and screw them into the secret briefcase that I had. That briefcase that I said I was going to build synth parts in. I've got a lot of that coming together. Right now, what I need is I got to order in some more wire so that I have different colors of wire, because there's a particular kind of steel solid core that I'm using that's perfect for this context, and it means you don't have to buy cables. Instead, you use plain wire of this particular kind, and you plug it into IC sockets that happen to fit it perfectly. So that is the magic trick for not having to buy interconnect cables for your modular synthesizer that you built in the DIY sense. I've also been searching for things like useful parts and chips and things, and I've got a lot of that stuff already. I've got a lot of CMOS. CMOS chips you can get for about 39 cents each. And the plan has always been to get mass quantities of this stuff and then distribute it to people at cost. Because if I do that, I get to be doing this thing, other people get to be doing it with me, and I'm not losing money on the deal. If anything, since I'll be capping it to what the Patreon does, it's a motivation for people to support that. And it makes sense to me. But making oscillators out of just raw CMOS chips is possible. There are certain kinds that are a very obvious pick, like the Schmidt trigger inverter. There is a particular chip that you can get, the 40106, where, and by the way, I've also got, I'm starting to make notes on how this stuff works. I've got these pieces of paper that are exactly like screen size and typically cell phone screen size. And I'm sort of using my cartooning skills to draw a relatively large image that has the relevant information, so that if you have this stuff, then you'd be able to like put these things into a perf board and start running wires to them and making them go. And that's the idea. That is the primary impetus there. So I've been also keeping an eye on the Curtis chips and the Alps knockoffs of the Curtis chips, because there are synthesizer integrated circuits that you can get that are much like these CMOS chips, except for that they're designed from the get-go to be a synthesizer oscillator. Like your Jupiter 8 or whatever, it's based on Curtis chips. I think it's the Jupiter 8, maybe the Jupiter 6. But the thing about that is that the Curtis chip is like $20. And you could well say, well, that's worth it. But still, if you want 16 of them, it is going to add up. And my whole deal is wanting to get this stuff put together with parts. Like, I'm tempted to jump up and grab my reels of tape. I have electrical tape. This is what happened to the thing that I had to show. Dang it. I'm confused. I'm not feeling all that well. On a previous live stream, I showed this little piece of perf board that had one section of it that was colored in with Sharpie markers. And you could see that it was colors, but it looked ghetto as hell. And then another piece of it was these strips of vinyl electrical tape. I found a place to get them. They've been sold out the last couple of times I've looked, though. But there is an Amazon seller that's selling this particular kind. And it's bad as tape, although I found it wasn't as shockingly bad as some people reviewed it to be. But it's bad as tape because it doesn't stick very well. However, using it as a labeling material on a homebrew synthesizer, the colors are wonderful. And it's just vinyl, it's vinyl strips. And I am going to grab some of this just a moment. I'll be right with you. I'm going to grab all this stuff. Seeing as if I don't, you'll never see any of it. And then I spring out with everything all worked out, and that's fine and good, but I can't get everything done at once. So this is what I'm fooling with at the moment. I'm buying this from All Electronics. I want more colors of it. It is 22 gauge solid core. It's actually steel wire. This will be your interconnects. Rather than having to buy like modular cables, which will cost like at least $1 or so each, even the connectors, doing a cable will cost you at least $1 or so for a single wire. With this, if you cut off a few inches, that's the pennies worth of cabling. You just have to be able to strip it, and you can spend money on a good wire stripper if you want. And then you can do all your cabling with this, which is why I want multiple colors of it, because I'm already doing a lot of my cabling with this white wire, but I feel like you can do more interesting stuff with multiple colors of it. And the thing about that is if I buy big old rolls of wire, all I really have to do to get somebody started is get a bunch of these spools together, like hang them on something, grab the ends of all of the wires, drag them about 6 feet, and then cut them off and loosely coil them up. And I'll be giving you like 20 feet or so of a bunch of different kinds of wire very handily and conveniently. And that could be distributed for very, very cheaply. You don't have to buy it in 100-foot rolls for all the colors that you would want. You don't have to buy it in 10-foot rolls, which is cheaper, but you start really suffering on the volume discounts. Ideally, I'd like to get some kind of crazy like 1,000-foot roll of some of this stuff. I think the 100 will do, though. But I'm looking to have multiple colors and just have it hung up somewhere. Grab the ends of all the wire, drag them out to about 6 or 10 feet or something like that, cut them off at the end, curl them up, put them in a box, and send them off to people. You shouldn't have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars just to get fully set up with way more than you would actually need to start fooling around with stuff. And it's the same thing with this. I'm deeply fond of this crappy Amazon electrical cable. I found it. I was looking for stuff that had all of the color codes that you could want. This is all the color codes that you'd have for numerically coding something by color. This is the same color code system as you have in resistors. And the thing about this, it's the same deal. Like, I spent what, like 10, 15 bucks on this, which is something that anybody else could do as well. That's fine. I can certainly like refer to this is where I got it. I would be doing that. But if I had a bunch of different, like 4 or 5 or 6 of these sets, one thing I can do is hang those up on a sort of mounting thing and grab the ends of the tape and hold them together and start stretching them out, make a sort of laminated electrical tape sandwich with every color. Because if you're using it to label stuff on your circuit boards, you're not necessarily using whatever this amount is. You'd be able to get started with just like, I don't know, a couple of feet or 6 feet or something like that. Maybe not even that, because that would, once you have it all sandwiched together, it's going to start getting kind of overly thick that way. Just a little small slab of sticky rainbow color electrical tape vinyl pieces that will work good for labeling. And if I can distribute small enough pieces of that conveniently enough, then people don't have to lay out the expense of getting set up with the full huge amount, and it just makes the little tiny starter kit way more exciting. Like, you can get a chip for about 60 cents or whatever if you go and order one of them through Mouser or whatever, and then you've got a chip, and you hope that you don't screw it up or break it or something like that. And you don't have any of the other stuff. You don't have cables, you don't have jacks, you don't have any of the things that you need. And I'm really interested and excited. This is the new invention, basically, in designing sort of the guts for building stuff so that people could get into starting to do it for really, 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 really cheaply. Like, definitely less than $100, maybe less than 50 for a good pile of random stuff, like 6 feet of wire of a couple of different colors, just because you're going to need to have wire. 2 feet, 3 feet of all the colors of electrical tape that you could want, just stacked together. And it might not be in a proper spool, but you're going to be cutting it into little tiny pieces to stick on your builds anyway. X amount of perf board to build stuff on. And I won't be distributing the boxes to put it in, but you build those yourself out of pieces of pine or whatever, and that stuff is really cheap. Or like some cigar box or a Tupperware container or anything. Really doesn't matter. The point is to be able to improvise beginning stuff that's actually fun and interesting and rewarding. Like, it sounds interesting, that looks really cool, or at least as cool as you can make it look. It's going to look really crazy. There's that. And one of the final pieces that's coming into focus, I'm not sure exactly how well this is going to work. We'll see. There is a post on Synth DIY, a subreddit, about a SSI 2130 VCO. That's a IC chip with a bunch of different outputs. It's got a sine, it's got triangles and sawtooths and things. It has through 0 FM. And rather than being like 20 for a classic Curtis chip or the $6 to $8 of the Alpha knockoffs, which are also intellectual property ripoffs, so I'm not sure if I'm that thrilled about those. I'm not sure if I'd want to start like emphatically recommending them, knowing that they're like, this is basically a ripoff of somebody else's thing. You kind of go like, well, what am I doing? Well, this new chip is completely different design. You have to build around it. It's tinier than the Curtis. It has 3.0 FM, which I don't think the Curtis has. And the introductory pricing is like $2, not $20, $2. Actually, I think it's closer to $3. Trouble is, the chip formulation is a 4.4 millimeter QFM chip. It's like one of those tiny CPUs. It's just a little square, a microscopic square. You can't even see pins on the side of it, much less solder to them. So this is not DIY-able at all. You'd have to be godlike to be, I mean, you can't actually solder anything that small with hand tools. So I've expressed my interest in getting a part like that that's soldered to a breakout board like the Teensies and things, because it's going to be like that. It's going to be like one of those tiny Arduino style boards where it's this tiny little thing and it sits on a tiny circuit board that has its own holes to solder stuff to, and those holes are double inline pair. Those poles are like the other chips that I use. And that's the thing about it, is if I can get hold of those on boards for very cheaply, including if I was to do that myself and go, I will make the mass purchase, I will buy 1,000 of these or whatever. If I can make that happen, and then make those available to synth hackers in my little solder core community at cost, at the mass, like volume discount cost, that to me would be a big victory. So that's what I'm looking into. What I told the person who was, and I haven't actually heard any audio clips, but the thing about this is when you get into these chips, generally this is what you're looking at for quite a few of your classic Warhorse unobtainium ultimate analog synthesizers, like the stuff that's heavily polyphonic. You know, your Jupiters, your memory Moogs. A lot of that stuff came out of chips like this, or the Curtises that are currently available again, but they're available at $20 a pop. And it's really the stuff around the chips that are mattering. Like when you have the chip that is designed to be an analog oscillator and do all these various things, they're generally done pretty well. And they behave well and they're stable. And they go across a bunch of octaves and they can be tuned and all of this kind of stuff. And they're not lacking tone-wise. They have nice clean waveforms, and it's up to you to filter them properly and do whatever else it is that you want to do. And so being able to get access, like I told the folks introducing this, I said, I'd be really interested in any access to this part soldered to a breakout board. Something like how you get a Teensy DAP mounting positions. Without pins would be just fine, because remember, you're sticking this, in my concept, you're sticking this onto a simple perf board, stripping the ends of this wire and running it onto the actual things that you're building. So you're soldering onto it as if it was a Teensy. Without pins would be just fine, so long as the breakout board lets you DIY the thing. I'm picturing the way Arduino type boards come. DIP spacing of holes that could support either pins or direct wiring. And I went on to say I love the introductory price, like $3 a pop. That's amazing. I'd love to start pushing for adoption of this in the DIY sphere, which I'm not currently doing anything for, but I'm trying to build this whole scenario together. But I can't work with it at 4.4 millimeter QFM. That's less than a centimeter. The entire thing is like a big. It's a square that's smaller than this, and it's a synth oscillator. But I think even the most primitive breakout board would get me there, especially if it's not a huge price jump. Like having to pay $50 for it on a board would be a deal breaker. How cheaply can you or anyone interested get it mounted on a board to make it more accessible? Assume that you can do some serious volume, thousands or 10,000s. And I told the guy, dude, if you can get it to me like mounted on a board for $3, you can have an order for 10,000 like right away. And I'm like, I'll make that happen. I'll come up with a way to do it. Talk to somebody and I'll figure it out. And it's like, going to that kind of volume that quickly is not practical. I'm like, shucks, because it's not terribly practical for me to throw that kind of money towards synthesizer chips so suddenly. But I was trying to make an impression. And I think I did. The guy was interested in hearing that angle on stuff. So that's the thing, is I am still working away and using everything within my power to get access to not only things like, here, you can have a synthesizer making kit that includes a small chunk of vinyl of these colors that you can use for labeling. And then the stuff that you make can be pretty, and I can include it very easily and cheaply. Or getting more of this wire so that you can have cabling to link your stuff together. Stuff like that. Or having newly designed synthesizer chips so that rather than just building everything out of CMOS and everything has to be square waves or whatever, not that those are bad, those are cool, but ability to work with some good oscillator parts for super cheaply. I feel like that is something that a lot of people would enjoy. I certainly would. I am increasingly enthusiastic about diving into that and spending some, like, when I get to the point where I have the, like, when I show something like this, I have 4049 chips. I need to add the E on the end of here because mine is a 449 UBE, but UB means unbuffered. I've got these. This is an accurate description of what's inside it. You're looking at it from the top down, and the triangle is an inverter, and the triangle is amplification. The dot means not. The dot is the inverter, and that's the symbolism for how you build the logic circuit. I've got these. I have some wire, I have some solder. I got a lot that's already ready for starting to put stuff together. What I need is, I'd like another couple of designs for reference purposes. Like, I consider this a design for reference purposes as far as making the tube sound fuzz or whatever, because what you do is you start here, you have one of the chips, and you go, okay, looking at it from the top down, here's where I put the positive lead, the red wire from my 9-volt battery or whatever. Or if you're powering it by 12 volts, which is also a good idea, then this is where you put the positive from that. Here's where you put the ground. It has a little ground marking on it. And then you pick a couple of these, and you go in the in and out the out, 2 stages of it, inverts and then inverts again so that it's back to normally. And you just have your guitar jack and a capacitor into here and a capacitor between these two, and then a capacitor on the output. So 3 capacitors, and then you have some resistors or controls like potentiometers, trim pots, whatever, connecting the out and in, which is what we call biasing it into constant operation, because this is a logic circuit. But if you short the output to the input, then it hovers around at like passing audio signals rather than just passing ground or high voltage. And it burns energy when you do this, so the chip will heat up. But that's how it's done. I need some of the other chips also with outlines like that so that I can start fooling around with them and have something to look at so that I know what to wire the chip to. Because bear in mind my concept here is heck with all the schematic diagrams, heck with all the strip board, heck with all of that kind of stuff. Let's just wire stuff together. That seems fun to me. And in order to do that, I have to have enough of an instruction manual that I can look at the thing and go like, okay, these are the pins that matter. This is what we connect to. And I have to have that for a number of different pins or a number of different chips, because there's also, like, I think it's the 4016, which can easily be used as a sequencer. It'll step along a series of outputs, putting the voltage, one after another, so you can use it as a sequencer. A number of different kinds of sequencers even. And I will also need the 40106 Schmidt trigger hex inverter, because that's the one where any of those little inverters can be made into a oscillator. It's like 6 little oscillators in a chip. You just set it up to go and have your capacitors and resistors and things ready to go. And you'll have 6 little square wave outputs at pretty much whatever frequencies you want. You just use different sizes of resistors and capacitors to do it. And with that and some of the control circuitry and oscillators and ways of turning them on and off, you have a functioning modular synth concept. So essentially what I'm waiting for is to get some of that stuff together, and then also to saw up pieces of pine wood so that I can put them into my secret briefcase case at the correct spacings, so that I can build these things with perf board and thumbtack them onto the pine wood, which is enough to go forward with. And that's where we stand. Also, I'm somewhat interested in getting together a amplification so that I can have a monitoring and be able to hear what happens in the room, but I also feel kind of like these circuits will power a small speaker. Sometimes it'll hurt the chip if it's being overloaded, but you can run it to something like an R-tone, and I have an R-tone. So I might be looking into just patching the outputs of some of this stuff directly into a speaker and going from there. That, or I'll be building little mixers for the purpose of amplifying this stuff, which is also a legitimate part of the resulting synthesizer. You will end up having to mix together multiple sound generators. So there's that. And yeah, David points out Home Depot will cut the pine wood for you for free, which is relevant. That's super relevant. The important thing is having the right size of pieces of wood and assembling them into a box with the right spacings between the planks that equates to Eurorack spacing, so that when you build stuff, you can put it on something and immediately use it, but the stuff that you build can also be used in a Eurorack system by drilling holes in the top and bottom of the pieces. And granted, also building some extra ones where you'd have the proper Eurorack ins and outs, because it'll be operating on the IC socket and 22 gauge cable standard, which is kind of microscopic and way cheaper. Let me have a look into the scrollback. I've been going on this stuff because I saw that some of the scrollback was talking about depression and stuff, and this is kind of what I've always done. You dive into projects and think of things to do. I'm not sure whether Ahmed was actually talking about this in a previous week. Theory. I seem to remember something about that you were interested in theory, and I've had some new ideas in that, so we'll be able to chat for the remaining slightly less than an hour of the live stream, because I'll have something to say about that. But let me check and make sure whether So scrolling back, way back. I think it's completely reasonable, LQ2, that channel 8 and console could replace bus colors. It's fair. I don't think bus colors is ideal. I think it's somewhat too colored. Unbox is probably a good example for purist mids. If you're looking for purist mids, I would try distortion, because that's mid-focused. It'll bring out the mids in various ways. It has the unbox algorithm going on, and it has many choices in that. So look to the distortion plugin for what you would call purist mids, in a way of emphasizing that. That might be good for you. Yeah, and I do have an LGBTQ rainbow of electrical tape, but this is also the color labeling. Like, if you're going to label stuff 0 to 9 by color, that's what you use. It's just the reality of it. The fact that it is LGBTQ rainbow is just an added bonus, I guess. Yeah, we should indeed have a Unbox 2, and it was called Distortion, and you have it. I think you probably even downloaded it. So, yep, we do have an Unbox 2. It's called Distortion, and you can download it today if you don't already have it. Focus on that. Depression is an interesting topic. I don't intend to go way deep into it and stuff, but I do find that fairly often my struggles with stuff like that is very situational, in that stuff will happen and be going on in the world, or indeed just in my world, that is unpleasant and painful, and it's not wrong to be honest about acknowledging that. It's also useful to, it's like, treat yourself like you're an active working revolutionary and you're struggling against something that's way too big for you. I'm not sure how many of you can relate to that feeling right now. There are rules around how to do that effectively. This is not just some random thing where anybody who is in a position like that just wings it. That's not how that works. You need community. We've got community here. I don't blow showing up for this off. As you've seen, if I don't have the ability to go forward with everything that I do, I drop other things first. I don't play video games anymore because that kind of went wrong on me. And I'm not doing music jams when other stuff gets too intense and I can't hold it together. I'll drop the music jams first. I'll drop my creativity first. I haven't made any new rock music since that one thing that I've been using for the last 6 months, it seems like. But I show up for my community. And that's one way of dealing with stuff like depression, is band together and have community, and also take time to not just be bashing away on the grindstone all the time. You take time to, go dark from time to time. Not everything has to be super effective. Sometimes it's not reasonable, it's not practical to expect you to be super effective all the time. So you gotta go like, okay, I'm only human. I'm only capable of lying in bed today. And you do as much of that as you can manage, and try to give yourself downtime, and don't demand too much, because when things do turn around, and you're not alone in this kind of stuff. One of the reasons why I firmly want to get the, all GDP rainbow of electrical tape, yay, all of this kind of stuff, is I honestly feel that I can design a sort of DIY concept where people can build stuff that's art. And whether you can do things like with your LGTB rainbow of electrical tape and make that be a commercial product that you're selling thousands of units and you're being listed in Musician's Friend. It's like, well, no, if you're building stuff off of pegboard, you can't. That's not reasonable. But if you can only build one or two and then you sell them on like Etsy or something like that, if I can put into people's past the ability to experiment and get creative in a way that they didn't originally have, so that they can charge off and experiment with some of this stuff, and then they're making basically art objects that most of my depression has been when I didn't have access to any money and wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to continue to live month by month. That's depressing. That is like bottom line, material conditions, depressing. And there's no way around it. But if you can set a thing up where it's like, oh, hey, I built a little synthesizer. Let me put this on eBay or Etsy or something. Or let me make a YouTube video. Or you watch my YouTube videos. Many people have access to stuff like that. You don't necessarily have to have the good production values or whatever. But if you can make a cool thing, that is a way of connecting to the world that can have more of a positive relation. So yeah, Andy's asking, like, what happened to the music jams? It just stopped suddenly. Well, I can tell you some of the thing about it is the reason that the music jam stopped suddenly is that something was happening in my life that I can tell you some about now, to some extent. And it's hard to say like how directly useful this is going to be to anybody, but there's no reason for me not to mention it. Also, Bo wanted to know about oversampling. Typically, oversamplers are going to work on stuff like they're just plugins, but they're running a higher sample rate internally. So yeah, going back to this, and I'm going to have to go back to my camera view so that I can see what this is. Yep. Going back to this, if you were going to reconstructing a waveform by putting these two intermediate samples in here, and the other notes are just ways that I might be able to make it more interesting, but if you just interpolate it like this, that would be 3x oversampling. It's 3 samples for each original 1 sample. And what you do is you generate that ideally in the same way, with the same frequencies that you have. Do your distortion and then downsample again, you're filtering again. And the extent to which you're doing that accurately is the extent to which you're resisting aliasing. So that's typically what oversampling is about there. The details of how it's implemented, often I kind of violate the rules for how stuff like that is implemented anyhow, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about it. And I will find some time to talk about the theory. Well, we've got about, a good 45 minutes or more, so I definitely will have time to talk about the idea that I recently had. That said, that is yet another one of the projects where I need to actually go and do the thing. Unless Bo wants to. Maybe Bo can figure it out. Do it in Reaper. But I can explain exactly what I intend to do. If you do it first, then rock on. More power to you. I keep having people talking about coming here or writing me and being like, please will you build this thing and this thing and this thing for me? And I'm like, yeah, show up in the Q&A. There's other people who might be able to build it for you that aren't even me. And keep the talking going somehow. The thing that I was going to talk about, as far as what happened to the music jams, is as follows. For the last couple of weeks, I've been doing a kind of therapy thing. It is actually the same thing that This American Life did an episode about. They have an episode called 10 Sessions. And the guts of it, and I can explain it in very simple terms, is If your head is messed up because you were traumatized when you were very little and formed ideas about how things worked based on that, and they have this big emotional charge, so anytime something happens, like I had an issue with people eating around me, and I would basically flip out because I felt extremely threatened, and it just brought up stuff for me, and I couldn't get past it. There wasn't anything that I could do about that. And I knew that in my childhood, there was an experience where my dad raged at me at the dinner table. And it turns out that somebody much bigger than you raging at you is enough. They don't actually have to, like, injure you or even hit you so much as posing a credible threat when they're a real threat compared to how big you are. And I knew that happened because that was one of my memories, but it was just a chunk that I couldn't cope with. And so it just kept coming up anytime the situation repeated itself and made it really difficult for me because I couldn't eat around people. It means you don't get to be Chris from Airwindows out of nowhere. You end up being Chris from Airwindows when you're messed up enough to where you can't function as a normal human being, and so you spend all your time indoors fooling with computers or synthesizers or CMOS chips or colored electrical tape, God knows what, all of that kind of stuff. And this therapy stuff is difficult, but seems to be very handy. And you could call it PTSD. That's exactly what it's like. So in this therapy stuff, what you do, and it is useful to go to somebody who knows what they're doing because it's not just randomly do it yourself, because I had a variety of ideas as to what I should do about it, and I was working with a guy who was like, yeah, how about we focus on this? And it'd be like, no, it needs to be like so. And you're like, well, trust me. And I'm like, okay. And then he turned out to be right. For instance, the thing with the eating, the functionality of it, like how this thing works, is as follows. What you do is basically the guy that you're doing it with spends a bunch of time counting. He is expressing time. And what you do is you sit there listening to him count and run through the experience, but not just the chunk that you can remember that is traumatic, that is the damage. He makes this rule, you gotta start from a time before that was happening when things were okay. Some context of like something that's okay. And sometimes that's hard to think of. It's like everything sucked back then, but you find something. And then you run it forwards through the traumatic thing and keep going until you get to another little oasis, another place where things were okay. And he starts you off at like 10 seconds. Like, okay, go. Be at the beginning, go. 1, 2, 3, and he counts. And at 10, he's like, yeah, and be at the end. And he's like, no, definitely be at the end. Don't just leave that off. You have to get to that point. And the whole thing is about placing this kind of in the flow of time. Because as, like I was repeatedly saying, and just to like quickly respond to Andy there, in many ways that's kind of what this Q&A stream really functionally is. So honestly, if I can get my shit together to where I'm building these other projects and I'm doing more live streams for the purpose of doing that, they're also going to be kind of like that. Because the when you're doing something like, playing games or building stuff on stream, a lot of it is just hanging out with people while doing that thing. So yeah, I'm fully aware that once I'm prepared to start with this stuff, that's going to be another time commitment. It could possibly prevent me being able to do live streams in terms of music, because I might have no time and energy left. But I feel like that'd be a worthwhile sacrifice, because with the music live streams, I'm not talking. I'm not really hanging out with people for those I'm performing. So to get back to my experience with this trauma therapy stuff, it's like memory reintegration therapy or something like that. There are various names. It's somewhat controversial. It's kind of like my floating point dithering. Some people are like, "Wow, this is really cool," and some people are like, "You're full of shit." So caveat emptor. But what you're doing is running through whatever the circumstances are of the thing that you're trying to remember, starting at this impossibly short time. You're going through like, okay, run through this memory, starting with just, you know that it's this nasty chunk of memory, this fragment that is just pain. And you don't remember it because I would not remember anything else around it. I wouldn't remember any of the details. I wouldn't remember any of the context. Never. None of the things I was actually working on were like that. And you started at 10 seconds. And you have to be like, okay, starting from a place that was not this, and then through into the thing, and then done. And it's like, wow, I can't even get a handle on this. I know that I'm supposed to remember the details of the thing, and there was no time. And he's like, okay, and now I'm going to count to 20. And the time starts expanding outwards, and the funniest thing happens, which is apparently how the brain does this stuff. Because it's like painful and difficult and exhausting. And I could be an absolute beast as far as this kind of stuff was concerned. The guy was like, dude, you're amazing. And I was pleased about that. It's a very sort of just Viking or Spartan warrior attack on this thing. Is I did not care what it hurt. I did not care what it felt like going through. I was just going to do the thing. And that turned out to be exactly right. And as the time expands outwards, and you're trying to place this experience, this memory, into context of other stuff starts coming up. Like there was this particular thing which was really interesting to me. It's not the eating stuff thing, but I can follow that outwards enough to explain what it was. Turns out that it was indeed a traumatic memory, but it wasn't all about me. I was a little kid, so I was really sure that it was all about me. But as I kept going over it, I'm thinking about things like, yeah, what led up to this? Because it always felt like I was about 2 years old and frightened and threatened. Not so much. I was more like, 7 or 8 or something like that. Enough to be a little intellectual wise-ass. And doing difficult things like, oh no, New England boiled dinner again, because it would have been something like that. And like helping out my siblings by being like, well, here's what you can do. This piece of potato, you can smush it up with mash with your fork, and then it's like mashed potatoes like Mom should have made us. And it's like, oh, dude, you were being a little jerk kid, weren't you? But that's how I felt. And I was like, this is uncool. What a lousy dinner to have made. And my dad being all overly enthusiastic about it, and just that was the worst possible attitude to take. And like, why don't you do that with the cauliflower and mix it with the mashed potatoes? Like, oh my God, what a disgusting idea. Never do that. That's horrible. And after a certain amount of that, that's when he blew up. And then the therapist reminded me of something, because I had said, like, yeah, my dad was really fond of like really hot Indian curry and stuff, which is the opposite of what New England boiled dinner is. Both my dad and my mom have passed away by now. So it's like, this ain't hurting them. They're not out there being like, Chris is telling on our secrets. It's like, no, that's not how that works. The therapist dude was like, yeah, I think you're missing a scene there. I think, between this time where your dad blew up at you and before then, when everything was fine, you're up in your room, right? Reading, because that was my fine space, was reading. There's probably a point where your mom's making this food and it's the New England boiled dinner, so it's really bland and it's kind of gross. And Dad comes into the kitchen and goes, well, what's for dinner? New England boiled dinner. Oh, no. I hate New England boiled dinner. I like really spicy curry, which she did. And then she's like, listen, you're going to eat the New England boiled dinner and you're going to pretend that you like it. And that was what he was really mad at, most likely. As a little kid, I couldn't possibly understand that. I couldn't possibly understand, like, oh, gee, mom and dad were having a fight over the very food that I was wising off about. And he didn't want us being mean to mom, but he was also covering up the fact that he was frustrated as well, and they were already on kind of bad terms. I just stepped into a minefield that wasn't mine. And that's what this kind of, this trauma therapy stuff that I was doing is kind of all about. I would be going like, oh, wow, that was there. Oh, wow, this was there. Or the guy going like, you know what probably happened? And I'm like, you're right. You're right. I know that was a thing. I just didn't think it related to right then. It never occurred to me that that could even be a thing. He's like, okay, build that into your movie. Keep running the movie. And it'd be like, okay, we're going to do this for 80 seconds. And I'd have like a real story going on with me upstairs and then coming down. And at some point that I'm not seeing that mom and dad are having an argument in the kitchen about the food, all that kind of stuff. And another interesting thing happens. I'm building this into this continuing narrative and the emotion is going away. He's asking me, like, do you feel, how intense is it? Like a 0 to like a 10. And there are people who are like, it's a 15, oh my God, I can't stand it. I never really got much beyond like 6 or so on things. Even while trying to relate, connect to the feelings of it all. But as you're like repeating this story, it's like, okay, I'm going to count to this, run this over in your head again, keep running it over in your head. Bits of it would come more into focus. I'd remember details that I did not have before, and the emotion would start going out of it and it'd start forgetting stuff. It would become harder to keep track of what was in the story that I've just been running over for the last 45 minutes. And that's when the numbers start coming back down. And it's like, okay, now I'm going to count to 50 from 80. And okay, I remembered the details of what happened, so I try to fit it into the 50. Okay, now I'm going to count to 30. All right. And I would accelerate it. And it would get down to like, okay, run it over. I'm going to count to 10. How much do you have to feel about that? It's a 0, man. I remember exactly what happened now. I know how that worked. And I don't have any feelings around it. And you'd be like, dude, that dragon is slain. You have killed that trauma thing. Which is not so much by making it go away, but being an adult revisiting that stuff in the context of everything else and fitting it into a larger story that makes sense. A story that makes sense. And he's like, yeah, the neat thing about this is that once you do that, that's pretty much all she wrote. It becomes just part of your story that makes sense and loses the ability to be like this shard sticking up out of nowhere with no explanation. And once it fits, it stops hurting. And I've experienced some of that. I have been experiencing that is a real thing. And I had to do it because I had a bunch of stuff that was really tormenting me a lot. And the neat thing is I still get to have all the stuff that I got through being this tormented person that did nothing but stay indoors and work on plugins or whatever. I have the same interests, the same background, all that kind of stuff, but a lot of things just seem less threatening. And that is the very long answer to what happened to the music jams. Because this was going on like, it's a bit amazing, well, maybe not amazing that I was still able to post plugins, but I was still posting plugins and doing the Monday chats while going very nearly full time out for full days, like 8-hour days of doing this with this guy, because it's like this bizarre retreat kind of thing. You're not meant to be like, okay, I'm going to go and see this therapist and I'll be seeing them for the next 27 years. That's not how that works at all. It's more dive into this thing, do this fairly mechanical work, which is strenuous and difficult. Like, they're one of those days, and I was warned. It's like, yeah, go and make dinner. Go and pack a really good lunch because you're going to need it. And I'm like, dude, part of the thing that I'm doing is it's bothering me even to deal with having lunch. So how are you telling me now that I have to eat lunch? Lunch is gross and I don't like eating and I have issues around this stuff. And you're like, no, trust me. And on one of the days, and normally I just make breakfast and a fairly small dinner because being a plugin programmer is not the most exhausting thing that you could ever do. If I don't watch my calorie intake, I'll gain a bunch of weight. But on this day, I go in, I make breakfast, I'm engaged already in doing this work, and it's 8 hours of really demanding mental work. And for lunch, I scoot over to the hamburger joint and get a giant, large-sized double cheeseburger. And I devour that completely. And also some, almonds as additional snacks and huge quantities of Starbucks double espresso coffees. The cans, the double shots. And head home afterwards and order a small pepperoni pizza and devour that and grab a nap. And I woke up at 11 o'clock and I was starving. Literally starving so much that it hurt again. After eating that much stuff during the day. Which just goes to show you how strenuous this particular activity is and why it's doing something, because it's really demanding. It's really taxing. And that's what happened to the music jams. I was doing music jams on Tuesday and Thursday, and I was doing this work on Tuesday and Thursday. It was conflicting. There was a time conflict, and there was also absolutely no chance that I was going to have the energy to do anything of the sort. I've been spending the last couple of weeks more or less going splat and just recovering from this. Not so much in the sense of I feel traumatized by the process. It's been very liberating, but it's been absolutely and completely exhausting. So, and of course, by the time that I start actually recovering from this, and all kinds of current event stuff is all messed up. But bottom line is I can get back to the music thing once I bounce back from this extraordinary experience I've been through. And that's more or less happening. It's just a question of, because the thing about it is doing something like that, and I see that my live chat has kind of gone dead. I should check to see whether I'm still even streaming. No, I'm still streaming. And that is fine. And I don't need to keep the synth DIY because I've told you about that chip that I was going to try to get. I've really felt like the music that I do doesn't particularly matter, and when I do it, I'm not sure I'm necessarily doing it in the right way. It's very interesting, the designing the synthesizers and the modular stuff, and I'm still super interested in that. I'm still intending to gear up and fool with that kind of thing and have some fun with it. But it does also frustrate me that I promise you I'll talk about the theory wheel. I've been going on about this to a silent and attentive audience, and I don't intend to talk only about that. Like I said, it's frustrating to me that the only music that I'm demonstrating the plugins with is this one very demanding day of rock and roll tracking. And I've just not returned to that ever. But there's a reason, and it is that, well, for instance, I had to do the taking the bass, is the Rickenbacker behind me, and putting the correct set of strings on it, which meant that I had to sample the round wounds, the roto sounds that I had on there. and I still have on my desktop a giant 45-minute recording of just sampling that I fully intend to make a sample set that people can download so that they can have my Rick in my sampling with the DI amp split that you can use Golem on to dial in your tone. And that's one of the things that I have to get done. I have successfully, and this time I didn't stream it, but I streamed putting the aluminum foil inside the snare drum. Well, all of that worked out so well that I've now got the aluminum foil trick in the kick drum and the floor tom, and I went and I took the one Gretsch rack tom that I had, and it wasn't installed because I have all these rototoms everywhere. And I've got the rack tom also with the aluminum foil in it. And it turned out so good that I'm probably going to be replacing the giant rototom setup that I've got with a simpler sort of Dave Grohl style kit, which is kick, snare, some cymbals, rack tom and floor tom, like 2 toms, and that's it. And leave the rotos off. I'll still have them. I'll still be able to use them for things. But in terms of going for the kind of Led Zeppelin-esque scenario, that's a redesign right there, which means that I have to rebuild the rack system that I built around the rototoms. And once I do that, I can record it, and I'll finally be able to try out the condenser mics that I got for the drums. And all of these things, I mean, I'm not sure how intensely this still governs me, but I generally go from a basis of, well, if I know that I have to replace those drum parts and things in order to have it be correct to do this, then I have to do all of that before I record anything new. And I have to fix this and that in order to before I can do anything new. And that's just an excuse to not record anything. I mentioned Grohl because going from the million drums thing like you get from a Neil Peart or whatever, or the rototoms like you get from a variety of different guys, including Bo Bruford, to the Dave Grohl style is like caveman drums, first of all, but it's also the one floor tom, one rack tom, just pound away, and it's about how you're playing them. In many ways, I kind of prefer that. Although I do also like having a kabillion rototoms, because that it's just, I never have a good reason to use it, but it's so appealing. And I mentioned Grohl because the thing about the first Foo Fighters album, this is getting into the evergreens territory again. Now I'm starting to tell stories about other musicians. Famously, the deal with the first Foo Fighters album is that he just decided he wanted to bang out a bunch of songs. And just got into a recording studio and started running back and forth between drums and bass and guitar, just banging them out. He just makes stuff up and not delay to worry about whether it was right. He just do it. He just makes stuff up. And in a lot of ways it shows. Like you can tell, like, okay, this isn't the deepest lyrics in the world. It's very emotionally felt, but it's like not the no Bob Dylan there exactly. But it didn't matter. It so totally didn't matter. And I easily fall into that trap of, I got to think everything out incredibly perfectly because everything that I do has to be ultimately perfect and exactly what I would want. And it's not about that. It never is. It's about sitting down and making a pile of chips, about going and doing the thing. So I'm moving in the direction of, rather than simply doing a techno music jam on Tuesdays and Thursdays for X number of hours, being able to be like, okay, I'm going to bang out a rock track. Let's make something up. And then I'll have something new to play with for plug-in demonstrations or whatever, stuff with vocals. Who knows? I mean, I've got a proper microphone. That's part of the reason. I got the proper microphone. Somebody was talking about how it was cool listening to me singing a Nirvana thing. Yeah, it's part of the reason in getting the proper microphone is so that if I get the guts to sing rock vocals, having it come out good. But yeah, these are all things that are underway and changing. And part of the outcome of doing like that trauma therapy stuff that's hopefully loosening me up a little bit so that I'm not so stuck just being trapped, having to make everything be perfect before I can begin to do it. There can be stuff coming out, and hopefully it'll also be pointing the way towards like what other people can do. Like if that works for me, it'll work for you as far as sitting down and doing something. And it always really did. I just wasn't willing to do it. And I have to remember to have some time for the theory wheel. But yeah. David, I think you just like the stuff that I do. So using the same track, it might please you, but at the same time, I think it drives more people completely insane. So I might have to throw you under the bus there as far as coming up with some new things to do just so that people don't go too insane. I'll just do Darude Sandstorm every time, yep. What's a poor man's U87 alternative? I know exactly the answer to that, and I'm happy to tell you, although I wouldn't necessarily go for an 87. I think the ideal mic is not necessarily an 87 copy, but a 47 copy, and the one that I would revise is the Roswell. Much like this is the fancy Roswell Colares and stuff, so it's like, what the hell is the name of it? I don't remember, but it's some extremely unobtainium microphone that they did a version of. There is a way cheaper version, and it is called the Roswell Mini K47. Roswell Mini K47. Those are freaking good. Everything that I saw on YouTube. And again, it's like I've got these for my drums. I actually got some of those for my drums months ago. Have never turned them on because I'm so busy doing the plugins and I'm so busy doing everything else. And then I end up being so busy doing this therapy thing and stuff. But that's part of the advantage of being that kind of person where you're burning all of your energy preparing and setting stuff up. Like if there's some coherency to it, when I do actually sit down to do the thing, the microphones will be there and ready to go. I will have done some of the work ahead of time. And as long as it's like reasonably chosen, like I'm going to want to play drums again. Especially now that I have the aluminum foil trick that John Bonham was using. And I've worked out what that is for and how it works. Because it's not about making rattly noises, it's about damping. And it works real good. And I could design my kit around having that work effectively. And so I know I'll be getting around to those microphones. Like do stuff that you know you're going to get around to. So rather than looking for a poor man's U87 alternative, I would go for a 47 alternative. I would go for the Roswell Mini K47. Very highly recommended. I'm far from the only person. And I'll tell you why it's so good. And I can say, like, okay, I haven't heard it because I am not using it on... I'm using it on the drums and I haven't been recording the drums. But everything I've done with guitar... in the most recent jams, you're hearing the Roswell K47. I changed from using an Airwindows Shure SM57, which is still very good at zeroing in on a particular spot of the cone. I changed from that to specifically using the Roswell K47, and that's what I've had ever since. In fact, it's plugged into my guitar rig right now. I'm not playing the guitar through it right now. So you are actually hearing it. And I'll tell you what's so good about it. It is a large diaphragm condenser microphone with a really big, wide, vivid sound that doesn't accentuate the highs like cheap condenser microphones does. the Mini K47 is really, really good at not adding like unreasonable glitter and sparkle on things. So when you're recording something, whether it be a distorted guitar or whether it be like wailing on the drums, there's not a bunch of crispy digital nastiness being added that you would then have to deal with. It's getting stuff right from the start. Much like my recording for doing these talks is being done through another Roswell mic, and it's kind of the same thing. It's definitely a little more glittery than the Mini K47, but it's the same behavior of it's delivering the correct sound to the preamplifier, so I don't have to fix it later, and that's always very important. So Lorenzo is asking some stuff immediately after that. I don't actually know what the Mike Lowry converter is, but you might look into it all the same. Lorenzo is sending the non-compressed signal to the sidechain on Reaper to do the dynamic. I honestly don't know. That sounds like a cool experiment. That's such a cool experiment that I'm not really quite sure what you're doing or what you're talking about. But as far as is there a gain plugin particularly suited for that, I can tell you what would happen with my various plugins. Firstly, don't try to use word length shift gain. Have I been swearing on this chat? If I've been swearing, then I can say bit shift gain because that's its literal name. Don't use that. All it will do is make abrupt jumps between gain levels. If you use purist gain or purist fade, the ones marked in dB, I believe, will still chase levels slightly. So that will alter the speed of reaction of your automation. You're doing your dynamic expansion. That means it will not be able to instantly jump to a louder sound. And if you need to do that, you shouldn't be using that plugin. But it'll smooth stuff out so it won't have artifacts as much. And if you needed to do it where you're compressing and sending the non-compressed signal to the sidechain automation to do a dynamic expansion based on the sidechain, blah, blah, blah. If you needed to react slower, you should use purist fade, the second slider, the one that can fade all the way to 0. Because that smooths and slows out the motions of the control. And that'll have another effect. So that will give you a gain plugin that does that for you so you wouldn't have to do it elsewhere in your system. It wouldn't necessarily get you the diode bridge compressor sound without sacrificing dynamics, though. That might be a whole other story. And yeah, what has been the topic of the day? Oh man, we've been all over the map. And Andy, I ain't telling you what next week's plugin is. There's a couple of possibilities. I don't know what it is myself yet because I haven't done it. It will depend upon what I try to do over the next week and what succeeds. But what I can do is talk about the harmonic wheel that you wanted to know what I was thinking about in terms of theory. So here's the deal. We've got this. I've had this harmonic wheel for ages. You'll note that this has chords and things on it. Did I ever scan this or put it out? Anyway, this is the wheel. And what you're looking at is notes, in this case, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which is oversampling depression. Yeah, that's it. And this is a mode. The notes that are in this stack are a modal scale. You pick the notes, and then the minors and majors are what chords you would use to fit into this. Like, if you pick a B, then the third of that B is going to be also one of these notes, and that will make it be a minor. The B major is not going to be available because that won't be one of these notes. That's how this stuff works, and that's why I've got like 7ths and 11ths and a 13th even on the Dorian mode. and why it's marked major and minor. The whole idea is that you can bounce around on this theory to nearby chords, and they're appealing to the ear. It appeals to the ear to step up and down in a scale, and it appeals to the ear to do a fifth jump. And this is also giving you whether you're in majors or minors or sevenths or whatever. So I was trying to figure out, how do I compose stuff where it's like, supposing I have I'm trying to think about what would be relevant here. I'll talk in terms of flats because that's what I've got it labeled on almost always. Or no, not always. I've got a sharp in here too. So say I'm doing an F, and I want to go, what chords could I use where there's an F but there's also an F sharp? That's tricky. That's interesting. And I thought to myself, well, here's my notes, here's my chords. I've been thinking of it in terms of these are just like scattered around. But if I look at where the Fs live, we got an F here, we got an F here, we got an F here, we got an F minor here, but that still counts as an F. Turns out my Fs are all on half of the wheel. They're living over here. And F sharps, F sharp here, F sharp here, F sharp here, each one of these divides the wheel up very neatly. So, theoretically, if I wanted to get interesting and weird and creative, and I was like, okay, so I'm starting off, I have a G7, an F, and a C. And I haven't been able to do this because I need to program it into a program or something. But what I'll be wanting to do, and Bo might do it faster by implementing it in Reaper somehow, is show these and then be able to block off areas based on what notes are there. Like if F has to be represented, then these notes will all be represented. If C has to be represented, that's going to block off another set of notes. Like let's have a look at that. C, C, and then C's gone. That's a D flat now. So we'll go the other direction. C, C, and there's our D flat, although this is actually also a C. So the way these line up, and I'm pretty darn sure that it's contiguous, that like if I'm looking for the note C, it's going to be on this side, and in fact here, and it's not going to be in here anywhere. Let me have a look and be sure. Yep, this is where we have our D flats, and this is actually a D flat and a C on the key of D flat in a major scale. So what I'm thinking about here is now I need to program another program where I can start punching in these notes and going like, okay, so if I started doing a whole tone scale and I'm going from these notes and then I go to another one, what chords relate to that? Or if I have a triad, and my triad is like F, G, and A flat or something like that. I need to be able to punch in those notes and go like, okay, this allows these ones, this allows these ones, this allows these ones. And so are there still any modes that contain all of those things? If I then made the D flat be a D natural, what does that change in the shape of the chords that I could go to? And it could open things up a little bit more than just having to be stuck into a mode or very close to a mode. I'm looking for stuff like that. Because the thing of it is, my hope is that that can be inspiring towards doing things like, I don't know, writing melodies and stuff. writing melodies and bass lines and being like, well, if I was going to use a chord here, what could I do? Because if you pick only a couple of them, like say you've got a C and a D, that means anything in this is legit. Any of these chords you could do. Any of these chords you could do. There's a C and a D here as well. These ones, not so much, unless you went to a D flat and a D. But over here also. So you could be going from like a B minor to a B flat major that doesn't actually fit in both of these, but they both have the C and the D. It's finding stuff like that and finding out which ones are prohibited. And then if you go to another chord, you're like, okay, this chord has this many notes. Let's say I'm going to focus on the Dorian mode over here, meaning that I'm using a C minor and the key note in the Dorian mode gives you a 13th. That's like, if you leave out, like it builds to a 13th, so it goes like 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th. And if you leave out some of those and keep only the characteristic note and then the basic triad, or indeed just the third, you're looking for like your root note, you're looking for whether your third is major and minor or minor, and you can maybe assume that the fifth is going to be there. And then you're looking for whatever the flavor note is. If you're working in C minor Dorian, that might give you another set of notes that could spell out another set of possible available chords. Because if they are all present in some mode, you could logically jump to that mode and pick a chord out of there. And even if it was kind of weird and strange, there would be a sense of harmoniousness through it's not violating the rules of the notes that you already had. You're looking at it from a different angle. And it would get you into that sort of Steely Dan zone of like, and we just went to a really cool chord and I can't figure out how that makes sense, and it totally does. And the reason is because it would be going to a chord where the mode it was in still contained the notes that you started with. And so I just have to wonder. It's like, if you go full John Coltrane modal harmony, you're basically stepping through the farthest available reaches in a kind of arbitrary way. But if you're building stuff like your chords are living around here and you want to throw in this weird note because it would feel good to like have this additional sharp or flat in there. It's like, let's throw in this funny note. Where can that take us? Oh, I guess we can start using chords over here because that note fits into this mode, even if it doesn't fit into this mode at all. Basically, you don't have to take all of the notes out of any one of these slices. And when you start leaving the notes out, that makes it more ambiguous and you're in several modes at once. Wheel doesn't really have a bright to dark scheme though. So that's probably, that's what I had as far as theory-wise was concerned. I have now filled you in on where I'm trying to get with that. And the part that I like about it is this idea of like, oh, you mean I can like switch off or light up entire sides of this based on whether a note is present, and it's following, because I didn't know initially that that was going to happen. I was like, okay, which ones have C? These. Oh, hello. That's something I didn't know was going to happen. I guess that tells me something about what's going on. And that means if I pick another note like D flat, it's going to be these, one side. And that poses some very interesting possibilities as far as how that goes. Or at least it seems like they should. It seems like it would pose interesting possibilities, and I have some reason to believe that if I pursue it, especially if I pursue it and then code some fun thing in the Godot engine that I can make open source, so if it doesn't work on everybody's systems, they can port their own versions, or I can put out a Mac, Linux, Windows version because it's a game engine that can export to Mac and Windows and Linux, then I can at least make a fun harmony toy to do. And I like the prospects of that. And I'm entranced by music theory. It's like very often when you get into heavy music theory, it just takes you in places that are no longer like human enjoyable. And you're never going to make a pop song, except when you do, you're never going to make a pop song with too much crazy music theory. You can, but you'd have to be Sting. There was a really great, I should watch this again sometime. There was a really great Rick Beato video in which he chose to do one of his Why Is This Song Great based on, I think, Synchronicity 2 by The Police. And other videos that he does, he's like, this song is great because the sound of these drums is good, or whatever. Or like, this is a really good groove. With Synchronicity 2, oh my god. He dove into the weeds in theory. And Sting was up to some really twisted stuff as far as the chords he was using for everything and the places that it just went bonkers. The song goes bonkers. The chords that Sting uses in that song are hilariously avant-garde. And dude pulled it off. So you just have to be Sting. Or you risk doing stuff that doesn't sound coherent to people. But this is why I'm diving into this stuff, is I should look at that Synchronicity video and find the chords that Sting used on this and see whether there's a located cluster or whether they're jumping around like giant steps or whatever. Maybe there will be an interesting discovery there. But that's the interesting thing about the music theory, is that it can make stuff more interesting and give more prospects of unusual tones and attitudes and vibes and feels and things. And yeah, music theory, as Bo says, does go apeshit weird at times. My favorite example of that is another YouTube video. It's Adam Neely. And I'm very into Adam Neely. He has done some fairly daring videos not so long ago, which I pretty much agree with his points there. But earlier he did some wonderful stuff on the Scoville heat value of various kinds of jazz harmony. And it was the most hilariously, like, you would not believe how deep the rabbit hole goes. It was glorious. It was just absolutely glorious. Because it starts like, okay, it's a pop song. This is normal. And then it starts going into like, okay, now this is getting to really funky, spicy notes. Okay, now it's getting into these pedal tones. Now it's getting into everything is so dissonant and ridiculous that it's just atrocious. Atrocious. And he would get into this incredibly nasty, inharmonic, embracive atonality. And it's just like, okay, now he's just stomping on the keyboard. Everything is just completely clashing and dissonant. And then he managed to go beyond even that by picking relatively normal chords, but using just intonation to tune the entire chords to the melody note based on the root of the chord up and down like 10, 15 cents. And the entire chord would be tuned up and down just so that the root note of the chord was in just intonation with the root note of the melody being sung. And it sounded like demented lo-fi hip-hop or something. It sounded alien, like from another world. And that's theory. That is, I'm not sure if you're going to get that into a hit song, but the strangest thing about it is that if you did that, you probably could. There was a weird harmoniousness to it. And weird harmoniousness, that works. That's useful. So yeah, Andy, as far as publishing this wheel, I'm probably going to just have to do the computer program to go the full 9 yards and do all of it. I could do a picture probably a good idea. I can't actually scan it because it's slightly too large to scan, so I have to take a picture of it in order to be able to do that. I will see. Seems worthwhile. Seems like I could throw that in there somewhere, because I do at least have this, even if it's not convenient to scan just as it is. And with that, we are at 12:51. Was going to go until 12:46, so we're going along pretty good. And it's been a fun and interesting Q&A. You're right, that would be a good idea, Instagram post. That's doable. The thing that I hate about Instagram, though, is I can't expand the images. I don't know how. So it would be a sort of, a cord wheel for ants in an Instagram post. It would become tiny. And on that note, let me switch back to OBS. And I'm going to head off and pursue the rest of my day. I can't promise that I'm going to have stuff happening towards the end of the week, but I'm moving back into the zone where I have stuff happening. Like, the question right now is, when I do have stuff happening, does that automatically have to be me jamming on the modular synthesizer and not talking to people? Or do I start doing streams where I'm building something and we're talking like this? Which I feel that's a good place to go, especially if it's an extended time. So I'm building something that's longer than, a limited time frame. Remains to be seen. Because if I'm building something that takes 5 hours, I'm not going to feel compelled to keep a running commentary going that's interesting and engaging for the whole 5 hours. But I can do stuff that I can at least talk about, rather than having to only do live jams where I'm basically not reading the chat, I'm not talking, I'm just playing and doing my jam thing. I don't want to completely stop doing those and never do them again, because I think that they're cool in their own way, but I don't think it's necessarily best to only do that. And I would say, in my defense of that attitude, that I did that for a couple of years and it never really built to anything. So it's like, people will come to the Q&A, but honestly, there weren't that many people doing that, showing up for that jam. That was basically for me. And I've learned the stuff that I've learned, and it's a question of like where I want to go with it. Okay, so on that note, what I will do is say bye to chat for the time being. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.